Hi everybody, this is Richard White with a brief introduction to writing classes in Python. Writing a class is something you do as part of object-oriented programming, and this video assumes that you already know about those concepts. An object belongs to a class, attributes are things that the class knows about itself, and methods are things that the object can do. Here I'm looking at a very simple collection of classes that I've written in Java to keep track of student records. Looking at these classes in the BlueJ and integrated development environment, you can see that there's a student class, the instances of which record a student's name and ID number. There's a classroom class, which manages collections of students in an array list. And there's a classroom manager class, a runner program that uses these classes to actually manage a classroom. For our exercise here, we're just going to work on creating the Python equivalent of one of these classes, the student class. Let's get started. I'm going to place the Java version of the student class on the left side of my screen here, while I create the Python version on the right side. Although there are integrated development environments for Python, I'm just going to write this class in a text editor, and then we'll use Python's interactive features to test that class. You can use any text editor that you like for this. I'm going to be using Vim. Just as in Java, there's a header at the beginning of the class that identifies the class name. If you're new to Python, note that we don't use curly braces to enclose a block of code. Python uses white space to identify blocks of code. Consecutive lines that have the same indentation are all part of the same block of code. And although you might be tempted to use the tab key to space over, that leads to all sorts of difficulties. You either need to use the spacebar 4 times to move over 4 spaces, or configure your text editor to substitute spaces in for your tabs. Here I'm going to use the spacebar to remind you that those really do need to be spaces if your code is to work correctly. In Java, javadoc comments are placed just before the header and are an important part of your code. In Python, an equivalent type of comment is called a docstring comment, and these are enclosed in triple quotes and placed just after the header. We'll see how this information will be useful to you and your users in a minute. As you already know, a class definition in Java consists of a constructor method, followed by a number of other methods that typically allow you to set an attribute, get an attribute, or interact with the data in that class in some other way. The process of writing a class definition in Python is just the same. To write the constructor method, we define a function called init. That's underscore underscore init underscore underscore, along with a list of parameters that will be passed in during the construction of this object. There are a few important points to note here. First of all, note the use of the keyword self. This keyword must be included at the beginning of each parameter list and must be used in the class for all references to the object's attributes, the same way that the word this in Java works. Note also that it isn't necessary to indicate the type of the parameters as we do in Java. Java is a strongly typed language that requires variable declarations that indicate what type of information, an integer, a string, a double, will be stored in the variable. Python is a weakly typed language in that a given variable may hold a string at one moment and an integer the next. So here we've written our constructor method. I'm going to add in a docstring comment right after the header for this constructor, and then go on to write the additional methods. Watch while I do this and see if this makes sense. I should have done a little testing as I was going through this, but I was pretty confident in my code. Now that I'm done, though, I really do need to see how this thing works. Rather than writing a full tester program, however, I'm just going to test it in Python's interactive mode, which will allow me to interact with a class in the same way that a Java IDE does. At the command line, I'll enter Python, and these 3 right arrows indicate that I'm in interactive mode. I can type in Python commands and have Python process them one at a time. In order to be able to use the student class, I need to import it into the workspace. Now let's construct a student. We've got our first error message, and this is a reminder that in Python we need to include the name of the file in which the class is contained. The parameters Roger and 001 will be passed and assigned to the instance variable name and student ID in the object S1. We can then get the information back out of that object by using the methods we've written. Here's another Python error message. It looks like the plus sign in Python doesn't let us concatenate numbers as we can do in Java. If I want to concatenate strings for a print statement, I'll need to convert the number to a string first. I can do that by using the str function. The last thing I'll mention here is that those docstring comments are enormously useful to people trying to figure out how your class works, and to you when you figure out what it was you were doing when you wrote this program. Just as the JavaDoc utility in Java allows for the automatic creation of documentation, Python allows for the same thing with its docstrings. One of Python's great strengths is its interactive mode, the one that we're using here, and in interactive mode you can get help on any code that has docstrings in it. Let's look at the documentation for the class we've just written. This has been a very brief introduction to writing classes in Python. Good luck with your coding.